Sometimes the gentlest knock is the one that changes an entire kingdom. Morning mist drifted quietly between the towering pines as Grace Bennet opened the shutters of her small cabin on the edge of the forest. The rising sun had barely reached the treetops, leaving silver drops of dew sparkling across the wildflowers that surrounded the little home she had built with her own hands. Life there was simple. Every morning began the same way. She swept the wooden porch, gathered fresh water from the nearby stream, checked the small vegetable garden behind the cabin, and brewed a kettle of herbal tea while birds welcomed another peaceful day. Most people believed living so close to the forest was lonely, but Grace had never minded the silence. She had always found comfort in quiet places where kindness mattered more than status. As she reached for the basket she used to collect herbs, a soft sound interrupted the familiar rhythm of the morning. It was not loud. It was barely more than a gentle scrape against the front steps. Grace paused and listened carefully. The sound came again. Slow, patient, almost polite. She walked toward the front door and rested her hand against the wooden latch. "Who is there?" she asked softly, expecting perhaps a traveler or a neighbor needing help. No answer came. She slowly opened the door. Standing on the porch was an enormous gray wolf. Its thick coat shimmered beneath the pale morning light, and its calm golden eyes watched her without fear or hostility. Grace instinctively held her breath. Every story she had ever heard warned that wolves should never be approached carelessly. Yet this one stood perfectly still, showing no sign of aggression. Beside its front paws rested a tiny wolf pup no larger than a house cat. The little creature's snowy white fur was tangled with leaves, and its sleepy blue-gray eyes struggled to stay open. The pup looked up at Grace before letting out the smallest whimper she had ever heard. Her heart immediately softened. She slowly lowered herself to one knee, keeping her movements calm and unhurried. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered gently. "You must be exhausted." The great wolf did not move. It simply watched as Grace carefully reached toward the little pup. She paused only inches away, giving the tiny animal every chance to pull back if it wished. Instead, the pup stumbled forward on uncertain legs and leaned against her hand with complete trust. Grace smiled warmly and lifted the little one into her arms. It weighed almost nothing. She could feel its tiny heartbeat racing beneath the damp fur. "You are freezing," she murmured. Wrapping the pup inside her wool shawl, she looked back toward the waiting wolf. "I will take care of this little one until its family is found." For a long moment, the great wolf simply held her gaze. Then, almost as though it understood every word, it gave the slightest nod before quietly turning toward the forest. Without looking back, it disappeared between the ancient trees until only drifting mist remained. Grace stood silently on the porch holding the little pup against her chest, wondering why a wild wolf would entrust something so precious to a complete stranger. She had no answer, only the quiet certainty that the frightened little life in her arms needed warmth, food, and love before anything else, never imagining that the first gentle knock upon her door had already begun a story the entire territory would one day remember. Grace carried the tiny pup into her warm cabin, closing the wooden door gently behind her as the cool morning breeze faded into silence. The little creature remained tucked safely inside her wool shawl, its small body trembling from exhaustion more than fear. She carefully placed it beside the stone fireplace while adding another log to the glowing embers. Within moments, gentle warmth spread through the room, filling the cozy little home with the comforting scent of cedar wood and fresh herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. The pup lifted its tiny nose, blinking slowly as though trying to understand where it had been taken. Grace knelt beside it with a soft smile. "You are safe now," she whispered. "You do not have to worry anymore." She warmed a small bowl of goat's milk and mixed in a little broth she had prepared the evening before. Holding the bowl close, she waited patiently until the little wolf gathered enough courage to take its first careful sip. Soon another followed, and then another, until the tiny pup drank with surprising enthusiasm. Grace laughed quietly. Someone was very hungry. After finishing the last drop, the little one looked up at her with bright, curious eyes before giving a tiny wag of its tail. Grace gently dried the damp fur around its face with a clean linen cloth before using a soft brush to remove leaves, twigs, and bits of dried mud tangled throughout its thick, white coat. As each careful stroke passed through the fur, the little wolf visibly relaxed. Before long it rolled onto its back, stretching all four paws into the air with complete trust. Grace smiled at the unexpected display. "I suppose that means you approve." The tiny pup answered by letting out a sleepy little yawn before curling comfortably into her lap. Hours passed peacefully. Grace spent the afternoon tending her herb garden with the pup following behind on unsteady little legs whenever it woke from another nap. It stumbled through the flowers, chased butterflies that always escaped, and occasionally stopped simply to watch Grace work as though memorizing every movement she made. By sunset, the cabin no longer felt as quiet as it had the day before. The little wolf had somehow filled every corner with gentle life. That evening, Grace prepared a small basket lined with soft blankets beside the fireplace. "This will be your bed until your family comes for you," she said warmly. The pup looked at the basket, then looked at Grace. Instead of climbing inside, it padded across the wooden floor and curled beside her rocking chair while she read quietly beneath the light of an oil lamp. She could not help but smile. "Very well," she whispered. "You may stay close." Outside, the forest settled beneath another peaceful night. Far beyond the cabin, silent shapes moved between the ancient pines, unseen beneath the silver moonlight. Several wolves paused among the trees, their golden eyes fixed upon the warm glow shining through Grace's windows. None approached the house. None made a sound. They simply watched for several quiet moments before disappearing once again into the darkness. By sunrise, Grace expected the little pup's family to return. Instead, another gentle sound would soon echo against her front porch, carrying a second tiny life toward the only home the wolves now believed they could truly trust. The next morning began with the same quiet rhythm as the one before. Sunlight slipped gently through the tall pine trees, painting long golden lines across the front porch while birds welcomed another peaceful day. Grace finished watering the small herb garden beside her cabin before turning toward the little white pup, who was busily chasing falling leaves across the yard with far more enthusiasm than success. Every few steps the tiny wolf tumbled over its own paws, looked around in surprise, then tried again with cheerful determination. Grace laughed warmly. "You are getting stronger already." The pup wagged its tail proudly as though it understood every word. She had almost convinced herself that the mysterious gray wolf would return today to reclaim the little one. Instead, another familiar sound drifted toward the cabin. Scratch. Scratch. Slow. Gentle. Patient. Grace looked toward the front door with quiet curiosity. The little pup immediately lifted its ears, not with fear but with excitement, before trotting happily toward the porch. Grace opened the door. Standing outside was a different wolf than the one she had met yesterday. This one carried silver markings along its shoulders and appeared younger, though its calm golden eyes held the same quiet intelligence. Resting carefully beside its front paws was another tiny wolf pup, even smaller than the first. Its soft gray fur was matted from traveling, and one floppy ear refused to stand upright. The wolf lowered its head slightly toward Grace without making a sound. For a moment no one moved. Grace looked from the adult wolf to the frightened little pup, then back again. "Another one?" she whispered, almost unable to believe what she was seeing. The little gray pup looked up uncertainly before taking one hesitant step toward the open doorway. Without thinking, Grace knelt and held out both hands. "Come here, sweetheart." The tiny wolf crossed the porch and pressed against her knees almost immediately. Grace gently gathered the little one into her arms while the first pup bounced happily around them, sniffing its new companion with obvious excitement. The silver-marked wolf quietly watched the reunion for only a few moments before turning back toward the forest. "Wait," Grace called softly. "Does this little one belong to you?" The wolf paused only long enough to glance back over one shoulder. Then it disappeared between the trees exactly as the first wolf had done. Grace remained standing on the porch holding the second pup, her thoughts filled with questions that had no answers. Inside the cabin, The first little wolf greeted the newcomer with playful curiosity, gently nudging its nose before leading it toward the warm fireplace, as though showing a friend around its new home. Grace smiled at the touching sight but could not ignore the growing mystery. 2 different wolves had arrived on 2 different mornings. Both had trusted her with an orphaned pup. Neither had asked for anything in return. As the day passed, she prepared another small bed beside the first basket, added another bowl beside the fireplace, and quietly accepted that her peaceful little cabin had become just a little livelier. Hidden among the distant trees, unseen eyes watched smoke rise gently from the chimney before slipping silently back into the forest, carrying with them a message that would soon spread farther than Grace could possibly imagine. There was a place where no orphaned pup would ever be turned away. The quiet routine that had once filled Grace's little cabin slowly transformed into something she never could have imagined. Days passed, then another week, and almost every sunrise brought the same gentle sound against her front porch. Sometimes it was a single soft scratch upon the wooden steps. Sometimes it was the quiet shuffle of careful paws waiting patiently outside. Each time Grace opened the door, another wolf stood before her with another orphaned pup resting safely at its feet. None of the wolves entered her home. None stayed longer than necessary. They simply watched until she gathered the tiny newcomer into her arms, then silently disappeared beneath the shelter of the ancient pines. Before long, the little cabin no longer echoed with silence. Tiny paws raced across the wooden floor each morning. Small tails wagged excitedly whenever Grace carried fresh bowls of warm broth into the kitchen. Blankets covered nearly every corner of the living room, each one becoming a favorite sleeping place for another growing pup. Grace repaired an old storage shed beside the cabin, turning it into a cozy nursery filled with clean straw, soft bedding, and carefully built sleeping spaces where the little wolves could rest together through the night. Every pup seemed different. One loved chasing butterflies until sunset. Another preferred following Grace everywhere she walked, never leaving her side for more than a few feet. The smallest enjoyed falling asleep inside the basket she carried while gathering herbs, its tiny nose barely visible beneath folded blankets. Grace somehow remembered every personality, every favorite meal, and every comforting routine. She never confused one for another, no matter how many eventually filled the little home. Her neighbors noticed the change long before they understood it. Travelers passing through the forest often stopped in disbelief as playful wolf pups explored the flower garden without fear while Grace quietly worked among the herbs. Some whispered that the forest itself had blessed the little cabin. Others wondered how one ordinary Omega could earn such impossible trust from creatures known for protecting their own above everyone else. Grace never paid much attention to the growing stories. Whenever someone asked why she accepted every orphan brought to her door, she always answered with the same gentle smile. If they arrive hungry, I feed them. If they arrive frightened, I comfort them. If they need a home, then I have room. The truth was that she had quietly stopped counting how many little lives now depended on her kindness. What once felt like an empty cabin had become a joyful little kingdom filled with laughter, playful mischief, and peaceful naps beneath warm afternoon sunlight. Hidden beyond the tree line, wolves often gathered in silent groups, watching the pups grow stronger with every passing week. They never disturbed the peaceful home. They only observed before returning deeper into the territory, carrying with them the same silent message that continued spreading from pack to pack. There was one place where every orphan found warmth, every frightened heart found comfort, and every lonely pup discovered family. Far away inside the royal capital, unusual reports had already begun reaching the Alpha King's council, though few believed them. They spoke of a humble Omega living alone at the forest's edge, where wolves willingly entrusted their most precious young without fear, a story so extraordinary that even the ruler of the territory would soon decide he needed to witness it with his own eyes. The royal council chamber fell unusually quiet as another forest ranger finished delivering the same unbelievable report that had now arrived from 3 different regions of the territory. Alpha King Nathan Carter remained seated at the head of the long oak table, his calm silver eyes studying the map spread before him while the messenger lowered his head respectfully. "You are certain?" Nathan asked. "Yes, Your Majesty," the ranger answered without hesitation. "The wolves are doing it willingly. No one has forced them. They travel from every corner of the territory, each carrying an orphaned pup to the same small cabin near the eastern forest." Several advisors exchanged doubtful glances. One elderly noble quietly folded his arms. "Perhaps the villagers are exaggerating another forest tale." Another nodded in agreement. "Wild wolves do not entrust their young to strangers. Such behavior defies instinct." Nathan listened without interrupting. Over the years, he had learned that the forest often obeyed older laws than those written inside royal libraries. "How many witnesses?" he asked. The ranger answered immediately. "More than 40, Your Majesty." Hunters, travelers, herbalists, and village elders have all described the same scene. Different wolves, different days, the same Omega. The room became silent once again. Nathan slowly rose from his chair and walked toward the tall windows overlooking the distant forests beyond the capital. Somewhere beneath those endless green hills lived a young woman who had unknowingly earned the complete trust of creatures that answered only to instinct. Even the royal wolf packs rarely accepted unfamiliar hands near their young. Yet according to every report, they now crossed the territory carrying their smallest and most vulnerable pups directly to her door. The Alpha King found himself less interested in the mystery than in the person at its center. What kind of heart inspired such impossible confidence? Later that afternoon, Nathan left the palace accompanied by only a handful of trusted guards, refusing the larger escort his advisors recommended. He wanted answers, not ceremony. They traveled quietly through winding forest roads until the captain riding beside him suddenly raised one hand. "Your Majesty," he whispered. A large gray wolf had emerged from the trees several yards ahead. It did not flee at the sight of horses. Instead, it calmly continued walking along the narrow trail. Something small moved beside its front legs. Nathan immediately recognized a tiny wolf pup carefully keeping pace with the older animal. The wolf paused briefly before gently nudging the little one forward with its nose. To everyone's surprise, the pup continued alone while the larger wolf turned away and disappeared into the forest. Nathan motioned for his guards to remain still. The tiny pup trotted confidently down the trail, as though it already knew exactly where it belonged. Curious, Nathan quietly followed at a respectful distance. The little wolf crossed a narrow stream, wandered through a meadow filled with wildflowers, and finally reached a familiar-looking wooden cabin surrounded by blooming herbs and playful young wolves exploring the yard beneath the warm afternoon sun. The little pup hurried toward the front porch just as the cabin door slowly opened, and Nathan realized he was only moments away from witnessing the extraordinary truth that countless voices had tried and failed to describe. The tiny pup reached the front porch with surprising confidence, its little tail wagging as though it had already made the journey many times before. Nathan Carter remained hidden among the tall pines several yards away, watching every movement without making a sound. The cabin door slowly opened, and a young Omega stepped outside carrying a woven basket filled with freshly picked herbs. Before she even noticed the new arrival, half a dozen playful wolf pups rushed across the yard with joyful excitement. They greeted the newcomer as though welcoming another little brother home. Grace looked down, smiled warmly, and immediately knelt beside the newest arrival. "Well, hello there," she said softly. "You must have traveled a long way." The tiny pup answered by stumbling directly into her waiting hands. Grace carefully lifted the little wolf against her shoulder, gently brushing a few leaves from its soft brown fur. She did not hesitate. She did not look around searching for reward or an owner. She simply carried the frightened little creature inside as naturally as though she had been expecting it all morning. Nathan quietly followed just close enough to see through the open doorway without disturbing anyone. Inside the cozy cabin, every corner reflected patient care. Small wooden beds lined one wall, each neatly covered with clean blankets. Fresh bowls of water stood beside carefully prepared meals. Shelves overflowed with herbs, medicines, and neatly folded cloths. Sunlight poured through wide windows where several older pups slept peacefully beneath its warmth while younger ones played across the polished wooden floor. Grace gently placed the newest arrival beside a warm bowl of broth. "Eat first," she whispered kindly. "Everything else can wait." The little pup lowered its nose to the bowl, paused for only a moment, and began drinking eagerly. Several other pups wandered over, sniffing their new companion before happily making room beside the food without a single sign of jealousy. Grace laughed quietly as one playful youngster tried to share the same bowl. "There is enough for everyone," she said with a smile. She calmly filled another bowl and set it beside the first. Nathan remained perfectly still. During years of ruling the territory, he had visited royal nurseries, healers' halls, and noble estates. He had seen caretakers performing their duties with skill and discipline. What he witnessed inside this humble cabin felt entirely different. Every movement came from genuine affection instead of obligation. Every tiny wolf sought Grace not because it had been trained to do so, but because it wanted to remain close to her. One little pup climbed into her lap, while another rested its head against her ankle. A third proudly carried a small stick to her feet, hoping she would throw it across the room. Grace somehow responded to each one with effortless patience, remembering every personality as though each pup were the only one she had to care for. Nathan's captain quietly approached behind him and lowered his voice until it was almost impossible to hear. "Your Majesty, no one could teach this." Nathan slowly shook his head without taking his eyes from the peaceful scene. "No," he answered softly. "They chose her long before anyone else did." At that very moment, another shadow appeared silently at the edge of the forest. An old silver wolf stepped from between the trees, carrying yet another orphaned pup. It walked calmly toward the porch, completely certain that the little cabin had become the safest place in the entire territory. The old silver wolf approached the front porch with slow, deliberate steps, carrying the tiny orphaned pup as gently as though it were carrying a promise instead of a burden. Nathan Carter remained hidden among the trees, unwilling to interrupt what he instinctively knew was another extraordinary moment. The older wolf stopped at the edge of the porch and carefully lowered the little one onto the wooden boards. It did not howl. It did not scratch at the door. It simply waited with calm confidence. Seconds later, Grace stepped outside holding a basket of freshly washed blankets. The moment she saw the little pup, her face softened with familiar warmth rather than surprise. "Another little traveler," she whispered. She immediately set the basket aside and knelt before the frightened youngster. "You must be tired." The tiny wolf looked toward the silver elder for reassurance. The older wolf gently touched its nose against the pup's head before taking one quiet step backward. Grace slowly opened both hands without rushing. "Come whenever you are ready." The little pup hesitated only briefly before crossing the short distance and pressing against her palms. Grace carefully lifted the tiny body into her arms and smiled. "You are home now." The silver wolf watched peacefully for another moment before turning back toward the forest without once looking over its shoulder. Nathan stared after it in thoughtful silence. Throughout his years as Alpha King, he had guided wolves through harsh winters, protected countless packs, and earned their loyalty through leadership and trust. Yet never had he witnessed wolves voluntarily surrendering their most precious responsibility to someone else. His captain quietly stepped beside him. "Your Majesty, no command could make this happen." Nathan slowly nodded. "That is exactly why it matters." They continued watching from the shelter of the trees as Grace carried the newest pup inside. Almost immediately, the other young wolves gathered around their newest companion with playful curiosity. One proudly offered a favorite toy carved from a smooth piece of wood. Another gently nudged a soft blanket closer with its nose. The smallest of the older pups climbed beside the frightened newcomer and quietly rested against it, as though showing there was nothing left to fear inside this little home. Grace watched the touching welcome with a gentle smile before preparing another warm meal. She somehow moved through the busy cabin without missing a single detail. She remembered which pup preferred sleeping near the fireplace, which one liked chasing butterflies through the garden, and which one always needed a little extra encouragement before eating. Every small act reflected patient love rather than routine. Nathan realized that the wolves had not merely trusted Grace to keep the pups alive. They trusted her to teach them what safety felt like. An elderly advisor who had quietly accompanied the journey finally spoke after many silent minutes. "There is a lesson older than the kingdom itself," he said softly. "Wolves can be guided by strength, but they choose to follow kindness." Nathan looked toward the cabin where laughter, playful pause, and quiet contentment filled every corner. For the first time, he understood that this peaceful little home had become something no royal decree could ever create. It was not simply a shelter. It was the place every orphaned heart somehow found before anyone else could, and even the Alpha King knew he was witnessing a miracle that had begun long before he ever arrived. The afternoon sunlight slowly settled across the little cabin, bathing the flower garden in warm golden light, while playful wolf pups chased one another through the tall grass without a single trace of fear. Nathan Carter remained beneath the shelter of the ancient pines with his small group of companions, watching the peaceful home that somehow drew every orphaned pup in the territory. None of the wolves guarding the surrounding forest paid any attention to the hidden observers. Their confidence rested entirely in the quiet woman who moved gently among the young lives she had welcomed without question. The elderly royal advisor stood beside the Alpha King with thoughtful eyes fixed upon the cabin. After a long silence, he spoke in a voice almost as soft as the breeze passing through the trees. "There is one part of the oldest prophecy that very few people still remember." Nathan turned toward him. "What does it say?" The old man smiled faintly. "Because for generations, no one believed it would ever matter." His gaze returned to Grace as she carefully brushed leaves from the fur of a sleepy little pup resting peacefully across her lap. The first moon elders taught that every orphan carries a silent question within its heart. They believe the answer cannot be forced by power or earned through fear. It is discovered only where love asks for nothing in return. Nathan listened without speaking. The advisor continued. "The prophecy says that when every orphan finds the same heart without being guided, the moon has already chosen the guardian of the next generation." The words settled quietly between them. Nathan looked across the garden where more than a dozen young wolves played happily beneath Grace's watchful eyes. She laughed as two curious pups tugged gently at the edge of her apron while another proudly carried a smooth pine cone to place at her feet as though offering a priceless treasure. Grace thanked each little one with the same warm smile, never showing favoritism, never rushing, never appearing overwhelmed despite the joyful chaos surrounding her. Nathan realized something that no report had ever explained. The wolves were not bringing pups simply because Grace fed them. They were bringing them because every orphan who arrived left fear behind. One of the older pups suddenly noticed a nervous newcomer lingering near the edge of the yard. Without waiting for Grace, it happily trotted over, touched noses with a frightened little wolf, and gently led it toward the others. Within moments, the newest arrival was running, playing, and wagging its tail alongside companions it had only just met. Grace watched quietly from her chair, her gentle smile reflecting quiet satisfaction rather than surprise. She had built a family without ever intending to create one. Nathan slowly released a thoughtful breath. Throughout his reign, he had protected borders, settled disputes, and strengthened alliances between packs. Yet this humble Omega had accomplished something far rarer. She had created a place where frightened hearts healed simply by arriving. The elderly advisor looked toward the Alpha King with quiet certainty. "Some kingdoms are built with stone walls," he said softly. "Others begin with one open door." Nathan kept his eyes on the little cabin as another distant wolf quietly emerged from the forest carrying one more orphaned pup, and in that peaceful moment, he understood that destiny had never been announcing itself with power. It had been patiently knocking upon the same small porch again and again until someone kind enough to answer finally opened the door. As the afternoon slowly faded into the warm colors of early evening, the little cabin stood surrounded by playful laughter that needed no words to be understood. Wolf pups of every size explored the flower garden, chased drifting leaves across the meadow, and occasionally hurried back to Grace simply to make certain she was still nearby. She smiled as one tiny pup proudly carried a pinecone almost as large as its own head before placing it carefully at her feet. "Thank you," she whispered warmly, accepting the simple gift as though it were the greatest treasure in the world. Hidden beyond the trees, Nathan Carter quietly realized that not one of the young wolves competed for Grace's attention. They shared it naturally because every one of them already felt secure in her care. After several long moments, the Alpha King finally stepped out from the shelter of the forest. His guards remained respectfully behind while the elderly advisor watched in thoughtful silence. Grace looked up from the little pup she was gently brushing and froze for only a heartbeat as she recognized the royal crest upon Nathan's cloak. She immediately rose and lowered her head respectfully. "Your Majesty," she said with quiet surprise. "I did not realize I had visitors." Nathan offered a calm nod. "I came because I wished to see whether the stories were true." Grace glanced around at the lively little family surrounding her before giving a modest smile. "I am afraid stories often become much larger than the truth." Nathan slowly looked across the yard where young wolves rested peacefully beneath the trees, shared food without quarrel, and played beneath the gentle care of the woman standing before him. "No," he answered softly. "If anything, the truth is far more remarkable." Grace looked down at the nearest pup as it leaned comfortably against her leg. "They simply needed someone," she replied. "No little one should grow up believing there is nowhere to belong." Nathan studied her for a quiet moment before asking the question that had stayed with him throughout the journey. "How many have you welcomed into this home?" Grace looked across the garden, watching another pair of pups tumble through the wildflowers while several younger ones slept peacefully beneath the porch. She laughed softly before shaking her head. "I stopped counting a long time ago." Nathan smiled, not because of the number, but because the answer revealed everything he had hoped to understand. She had never measured kindness. She had simply continued giving it. The elderly advisor stepped forward with quiet admiration. "Your Majesty," he said gently, "there are castles larger than this cabin, but I have never seen a home filled with greater peace." Nathan nodded in agreement. Looking at Grace, he finally understood why wolves from every corner of the territory trusted her beyond instinct. She had never asked who belonged to which pack, who carried noble blood, or who could offer something in return. Every orphan arrived as a stranger and stayed as family. The Alpha King lowered his head with sincere respect, not as a ruler greeting a subject, but as a father honoring the woman who had given countless abandoned children a future. Around them, the little wolves continued playing beneath the evening sky, completely unaware that their simple trust had already changed the heart of a king. In that peaceful moment, Nathan understood that kingdoms were protected by strength, but they endured because of people like Grace, whose open door and gentle heart had quietly become the safest place in the entire territory.